Okay, this is Adam from AModelOfControl.com at StayInFest, and I'm here with Spectres. Hi, folks.
Hello.
Hi, Adam.
Tell me about yourselves. I know a bit about you guys, and I've listened to your music, but I know very little about the band. Tell me about it.
Spectres started about 12 or 13 years ago. It was initially me and one of my friends from high school. We started it in a small kind of provincial town that we'd both grown up in, and both found ourselves back in our early 20s. And we just kind of cultivated this interest in darker music. We were both really into Joy Division and a lot of peace punk at that time, things like Christian Death and Crisis specifically. Crisis was probably the biggest influence on our musical tastes and at that time, maybe some early Death in June too. And we really just wanted to start a band that kind of amalgamated all of those influences into one thing. And we were kind of living in a vacuum. It was me and him in a tiny town. And yeah, we came up with Spectres, and it's definitely evolved a lot over the years and changed with any current members. But that was kind of the original intent of the band, and I think there's definitely still vestiges of that in the sound.
So when did you join then, Zach?
So, I mean, Brian and I have been friends since we were like 15 or 16, and we had been living together down in the States. We had both kind of gone down there for school for a little while, and Brian had gone back home and done this sort of that Spectres demo project with Steve Henker, the original guitar player, on the demos and in the first few recordings. And he came back and he sort of had this recording. Was like, oh, you know, me and Steve did this on the weekend, and we were sort of listening to it and I, you know, thinking, oh, this is really cool. I mean, at the time, I didn't even really play guitar. I mean, I owned a guitar or whatever, but I wasn't really doing bands. And when he and I both moved back to Vancouver, sort of quite a bit of time had passed after the release of the demo, and not sort of much activity with the band. Brian had sent the demo out to quite a few places, and after it probably was like a year, I think, after the demo sort of had gone to Frank from Whisper in Darkness label, and then come back, and he said, you know, he wanted to release a single, and you know, or whatever we wanted to do. So at that point, Brian began to put together a sort of full band, because it initially had, the demos were just him and Steve kind of playing everything. So he asked me to play guitar, and I sort of had to work on my chops and join the band. And then we, some friends of ours, Nathan and Heather Salaji, who are also no longer in the band, but they joined on bass and drums. So we at that point created the full lineup. And I've been with that sort of lineup since we started with the first 4 7-inch, and we've kind of continued. Brian and I are the only two who've really been with the band the whole time, like since we've been recording and touring and playing shows.
So you, if I see it correctly, you released a recent album, Nostalgia, on Artifact last year, and then they re-released your previous releases. Was that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
How do you feel you've changed since the original releases in terms of your sound? Is there kind of, because there's always the evolution that you learn more, you kind of adapt your sound. What would you say is the difference between how you started out and what you sound like now?
Well, I think every member who's kind of come and left has changed the band in a pretty big way at some point, especially in the sound. And I think that you can hear that through the shifting membership of the band from time to time. I mean, earlier it was definitely a lot more influenced by anarcho-punk and maybe more like death rocky and like harder post-punk things, like I'd mentioned earlier. And as time has gone on, it's definitely come to like encompass more pop elements. And those are always the types of music that I've liked. I always really liked a lot of specifically like English 80s new wave. And I think there's elements of that, like a lot of like twee stuff, like Sarah Records things. I think there's even a like kind of elements of that with Shannon's backing vocals in mind on some of those tracks. I was almost trying to do like a bit of a field mice thing. I don't know if it always came through, but those are definitely like the types of influences. Like Martin Newell and Cleaner Some Venus are definitely like huge influences on the newer stuff too. And I think that'll continue to evolve. We're in the process of writing a new record right now. And I think that it'll probably push further astray from that and go in different directions again.
Oh, okay.
I think too, like, I mean, as we just, you know, we've been doing this for so long. When you play together for a long period of time, you sort of, you anticipate each other's songwriting, each other's ideas. You sort of, someone will come in with an idea, and I feel like it's easier to sort of get into a similar headspace around, okay, I know exactly what kind of a guitar line he's looking for with this bass line or whatever, or that kind of thing. So I mean, it just, bands change and evolve over time, and it's kind of difficult even to describe how that process works.
How's it been for you over the last year and a half? Because obviously, you had a new album out. I mean, that would have been time that you'd have been promoting that, right? That's kind of taken the wind, must have taken your wind out of your sails a bit. Is playing live something you really thrive on?
It's different depending on where we are and what's happening at any given time, I think. I mean, we've tried to take advantage as much as we can of the past year when we can play live to try to promote things, and basically have a whole new record written soon, and we're going to go into the studio hopefully in February. We have tons and tons of demo songs that are almost at a point where they could be ready sometime soon to record again.
Yeah, we've just tried to stay active as much as we can. I mean, there was sort of lengthy lockdown periods where we weren't even rehearsing as a band, and that was difficult. But we, at points where the lockdown has been eased, we have practiced, and as Brian says, we've just tried to focus on the creative element, write new songs, and really spend our time with them. And I mean, in some ways, it's been very freeing to not have to worry about keeping a live set really sharp. We all very much miss playing live, but being able to show up every week and just sort of not worry about keeping those standards, sharp and ready for performing, and just diving, headfirst into the new material has been okay. But it's challenging. It's a challenging period of time for any band, I'm sure, just to sort of adjust to the sort of brand new landscape and not really knowing what the long-term trajectory of playing live and touring and all those things are going to be like. So, but we take it one step at a time and just focus on the things that we enjoy doing, which is writing songs and playing together.
I think that's something really interesting that I saw. I think it might have been on the NME website the other week, was pointing out that for many bands, not playing for some time could mean that people that come to see their early shows, they're going to have to get used to the fact that bands are feeling their way back into doing this again. That even to the point where people's voices might have changed a bit. That it may not be the same band that you heard 18 months ago. Do you think there's a grain of truth in that for some bands?
Oh, certainly. Yeah, I think that's unavoidable, and I think probably you'll see changes in every band. I think just the isolation will affect it too. People being in a vacuum for that long, it'll have changed people's influences. It'll have changed people's perspectives. It'll have changed people's writing styles. I think there'll be a lot of changes, definitely.
Yeah, and we're preparing to play our first sort of gig back, and even just kind of thinking about what's that going to be like to perform after all this time. And as I say, I mean, the live set sort of just went out of our mind in terms of a priority. It's just really been about writing new material and thinking about what we want to do with that. And we were fortunate enough to actually get in the studio and record a new single for a singles compilation that we've got coming out this fall. And that was good fun. And when we were recording with Jesse Gander, at the time, he's a well-known producer here in Vancouver, he said, he's booked up so solidly because everybody's doing the same thing that we're doing, which is just writing new material, and you can't really do anything else. So you want to get in the studio and record. So I think that it is kind of interesting. There's like this built-up potential of new material that people have probably been working on and preparing, and we're going to see a lot of that starting to sort of hit the market, hit the platforms, and all hit records and stuff in the next little while. And yeah, I think probably it's going to be a period of interesting change and hopefully innovation and stuff in music.
I think there's also, I mean, I've been looking, you saying that there's like this flood of music to come. I think there already has been. I mean, I keep a record for when I'm doing kind of release roundups and whatever else, and keeping an eye on what I might include in my end of year list. I'm already up to nearly 300 releases this year that might be relevant to what I do, never mind the wider thing. That's twice what I was looking at last year, because there's just been, everyone's been releasing something, and everyone's like taking advantage and going, actually, let's just do another 4-track EP, another album. Yeah, I got this in the can last year. Let's get it out there. I know of at least 2 or 3 artists in the UK who are better known for other projects in our scene, who've got bored, released this new album, released this new EP on a new project because I had time to kill, and we're like, actually, that's better than what you were doing before. This is great. But it's like, it seems to have unleashed this wave of creativity. And for others, it's been paralyzing. I think, you know, for me as a writer, I've done less this last year because, of course, I'm not writing about gigs. I'm not writing about festivals. And also, there are times where I'm just like, you know what, I'm actually going to just switch off and actually take some time down. And I think you know, not everyone has been able to race forward and do lots more. But I think there's an acceptance that everyone is treating this differently because everyone's experiencing this differently.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think anybody ever anticipated that things would go the way that they have. And I can think, you know, even in terms of how it's impacted us in our own process, you know, we used to get together to rehearse. Somebody would bring in a song idea. We'd sort of make a quick demo on someone's phone, and that would be the extent of it. But in this period, Brian has really learned recording software and demoing, and our, you know, our process, our approach to that has become much more technical because, yeah, we've had the time to learn more about that process and you know, dig into it rather than just sort of like, okay, here's an idea, let's make a really rough scratch demo of it and move forward. So I don't know. I mean, probably we will see more focus on the technical aspect of things because people have that time and ability to really dig into the, you know, the nuts and bolts of how to make really crazy recordings, even from home and that type of thing. And digital, I mean, it's no surprise that you're hearing a lot of drum machines and synth and all that kind of stuff coming in all kinds of records these days because, you know, it's so easy to sit at home and have your tools set up in that way and sort of record straight to your computer. So yeah, I'm curious. I don't know how the long-term impacts will be.
So moving on a little bit away from, let's get away from COVID for a while, shall we? Let's go way back in history, because in bizarre timing, after listening again to Nostalgia this morning, and there is, you know, you mentioned the death rock influence earlier, there is very much a feel of at least a nod to the past on what you do. Even though it's very much you know, post-punk death rock is very much a thing again at the moment, and I'll come back to that. But in bizarre timing, one of the originators of death rock, of course, Ollie Wisdom, died today, or his death was announced today. Weirdly, he became a psytrance DJ in the Far East. I mean, could that be any further away from being in a black, grimy basement club in London in the early 80s? Who knew? But were you aware of that kind of music, of like the early death rock stuff when you were starting out and when you were getting into this kind of music?
Yeah, totally. I was pretty into it. I was into like a lot of American and British stuff at the time, like, you know, like Alien Sex Fiend, obviously mentioning that, and like Sex Gang Children, and like Christian Death, of course, was like a huge influence. But there used to be this webpage called deathrock.com, and that's how I found out about a lot of those things. And that's how I first found out about like Crisis and Southern Death Cult and a lot of those bands. I'd like to say it was something like more romantic, like looking through 7 inches at some dusty shop, but it wasn't. It was the internet, because I was living in the middle of nowhere in a farming community on a rural island in Canada, right? And if it wasn't for that webpage, I would have never known about any of those things, and I wouldn't have started Spectres, and none of this would have ever happened. And I really do think that webpage, deathrock.com, it used to mean a ton to me, and that's how I learned about the entire scene, honestly. I used to be really into like crust and oi and street punk and like that type of stuff before. And I had no idea what this music was until I found that. Of course, I knew about like new wave and like bigger kind of like post-punk bands, but the subgenre, I was completely ignorant of it.
What about you, Zach?
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, I think a big sort of narrative that we probably haven't even talked about that much in various interviews is really going back to the history of the band, is that Brian and I sort of, and many of the various people who've come through the band over the years came through the sort of DIY punk scene. And at that time in the early 2000s, here in our neck of the woods, that was focused entirely on sort of crust and hardcore, grindcore, like very, very heavy, metallic influenced sounding guitars and everything, and which is fine. I mean, I'm not knocking that sound at all. But I think a big part of it was a reaction to that. We had been so inundated with that type of music. All of our friends were playing in bands like that. Every gig you went to was something that sounded like that. And I think Brian, even before I was in the band, Brian really wanted to make something just different than that. And that was, you know, I think a big part of what we set out to do. And it meant that for the first 5 years of our existence as a band, we were sort of that oddball act on most of the bills that we played, where, you know, people would sort of look at us and there's no real frame of reference. If you read every single review or every single interview from those first 5 years, was all people could say was, "Oh, you guys like Joy Division, or this is a Joy Division band or something." And we do, like, you know, I love Joy Division, but that wasn't like, let's start a Joy Division cover band. It was really just that people didn't have that reference. There was nothing, at least in our scene, in our community, nobody was talking about post-punk music or death rock or any of the, you know, anarcho-punk to a certain extent, but only in this certain very crust, the way it related to crust and what was happening for most of our friends. So
there was a huge element of that too. Like, before I ever knew what death rock was, I was into anarcho-punk, and a lot of those bands had crossover, like, I don't know, Androids of Moo or like Blood Robots. Like, a lot of those bands had like a bit of a weird post-punk thing, or Apostles, and some of them even like breaching more into death rock kind of sensibilities. Like, I can't really think of any specific examples, but there was a huge like kind of cross-pollination of that type of music. It felt like a bit of a gateway into that death rock stuff, and especially through that webpage, it kept me back to that ultimately.
Yeah, I mean, I think like Rudimentary Peni is one that really comes to mind. It's like a band that when I was a kid, you know, I was a huge fan of Rudimentary Peni, and thought of them really in that same kind of coming from that same scene as Crass and the Mob and you know, Anthrax and all the original sort of UK anarcho-punk bands. But then, you know, there was always something about it that was a little bit different and darker, and thematically it was very sort of off on its own tip. And so I think that those are the things that for me kind of led into a path of death rock and the sort of more goth side of that scene.
The whole Rudimentary Peni Death Church record is like, it's more death rock than it is anarcho-punk.
Yeah, totally.
I think a lot of people would say that.
I think this is really interesting because in London, London has been kind of one of the hearts of the kind of the post-punk revival for what feels like forever now, because it's one of the like kind of industrial techno kind of paralleling it. Both of them are kind of the main prominent things that are kind of running through the scene at the moment, and everyone's involved in it in one way or another. And I think there's some really interesting stuff coming along here, in that there's lots and lots of bands that are coming into post-punk stroke death rock, because I think the two scenes nowadays are kind of intertwined in many ways. But I think what's really interesting is that many of the people that have come into this are not coming from a goth angle. They're coming from external influences that then discovered the music and actually realized they quite liked it, and it ended up bringing in and a kind of almost bypassing the gatekeepers that the goth scene sometimes has, and has a unfortunate reputation and sometimes deserved for. Do you think that's kind of helped to reinvigorate it, in that we're not, you know, people have been able to go, well, I don't have to worry about it whether it's going to appeal to goths, because if you look at any show, half of the people there are not goth in the best sense of the word.
It's weird. Every time we've ever toured, I've kind of seen these changing subcultures at shows. When we first went, it was all the crusty punks, and then the next time there was goths and crusty punks. Then it kind of evolved, and sometimes we would see like skinheads and mods and stuff at our shows. It's so bizarre, but I feel like that's kind of like speaking to what you've mentioned there. It's like people are coming at the music from different angles and maybe like different similar musical legacies, but ultimately, like, there's a lot of a mixing pot that's going on within like the post-punk or goth or death rock scene or whatever you want to call it. And I think that it often gets kind of discredited and pigeonholed into something that maybe isn't. And I think it's a lot more broad and diverse than people give it credit.
Yeah, and I think that it's that all that gatekeeping, all of that sort of scene, the boundaries that existed around scenes are not sort of relevant to a younger generation of people who grew up just pulling up YouTube and looking up literally anything. You saw, I remember, I think Brian and I would be of the generation that sort of straddles that divide, because my earliest memories, being sort of 12, 13 years old and really becoming obsessed with music, was looking at a CD at the time and looking for pictures of the band and what T-shirts are they wearing, what flyers are on the walls behind them in the photographs, and then having a list of like
thanks credits.
Yeah, exactly. Who did they thank?
Yeah.
And then so that's my list to go on. Those are my leads. But then even from that point on, a few years later, and this is talking about ancient history here and the history of the band, Brian and I became friends via Napster. We had, 2 crews of friends that were Napster users when we were sort of, I don't know, in the 9th grade or something like that. And because of the feature of being able to see each other's music catalog and then send a private message and say, hey, you got great taste in music, we sort of struck up this friendship, and here we are, whatever, 25 something years later, and playing in a band together and all these other things. But I think that was the beginning of the end for that sort of gatekeeping era, where it's sort of, you learned by word of mouth and by these various sort of organic means. You had to do your homework and really dig down to learn about bands and figure out what was cool. Nowadays, if you see somebody wearing a T-shirt that looks aesthetically interesting to you, you just look it up on YouTube or on Spotify or whatever, and there's your, oh, that's cool, whatever. And so I think all that stuff from the past is sort of, I don't think, very relevant for today's listeners, and that's probably for the best because
I agree. I totally agree.
It's going to lead to more interesting cross-pollination and stuff, but it is kind of it's always interesting to talk about how much, having witnessed that change sort of take place in my lifetime, for sure.
I think that's true. I mean, I remember, I must be slightly older than you guys. I went to uni and I went to university in 1996. And I remember the power of the internet coming to me by conversing on like message boards or mailing lists about particular bands and finding out about like the death of a lead singer of a band I loved at the time and still do, the following day after he died, from someone who lived in the same town. And was just like, what? And it was just suddenly, that was a switch that kind of flicked for me of like, wow, this is what this can do. But we discovered our music. I discovered my early like alternative loves when I was a teenager in the early 90s from 120 Minutes on MTV was kind of the first thing that, once I discovered alternative music, that was my first port of call. And then it was, looking down CD liner notes and looking at who they thank, what are the bands are they referencing, what are they. But I found out far more about the bands that I was into then, now, thanks to the research that's been put on the internet, than I ever would have found from one tiny KG interview in the music press at the time. Be that buying alternative press on import or by listening to reading Kerrang or whatever. And I think you're right. The thing has changed, but then you look at the pop music scene right now, the kind of the melting pot that it is. It's almost impossible now to separate out an artist who's doing trap from an artist who's a hip hop artist to a pure pop person, because they're kind of pulling in all kinds of things. And you're listening to something and going, hang on, they've just sampled this. Like okay, so Clipping are partly an industrial act and as much of a hip hop act, but they sampled White House and became a reviewed single on Pitchfork and such like. And I'm like, they're reviewing one of the most extreme musical bands I've ever heard. And they got away with using a sample by that. And I'm like, well, that's weird. More people have probably heard White House thanks to that than any other way. And I think, and then you look at things like my wife listens to some of the newer pop like Ashnikko and whatever else, who is all over the place and is, there are no boundaries anymore for pop music. And I think the message is starting to get through to our side. And, there are newer industrial and goth artists I hear, and I'm like, no, sorry, I don't get that. And I suddenly realize it's not aimed for me. I'm 43. I don't, it's not something that it's not aimed at my age group. And the kind of the kids that are coming into this now are all over it. Good for them. If that means that the scene is changing and evolving and won't die, I'm all for it. Even if it means I may not listen to it, that's fine by me.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's interesting. It's very different than the way we we grew up and learned about music, and you played that game where, somebody you had to be ready if somebody was going to grill you on your credentials to know if you actually knew about the band that you were wearing the T-shirt of or whatever. is it such a bad thing that that's not really the reality anymore? Maybe not.
Quite.
But,
yeah. Yeah, I think there is, the change is really important, and I think, what in terms of let's move this on. What are you guys listening to at the moment? What new stuff have you been listening to recently? Is there anything that's jumped out?
I mean, I've been listening to tons and tons of Ginger Root. It's like an artist from California, Southern California, doing like a new take on 80s Japanese city pop. That's all I'm listening to right now. I can't get enough of it. It's fantastic.
Wow.
I've also been listening to a bunch of Nuevo Testamento because I did backup tracks on some of their songs, and I really like it. It's like Italo disco kind of stuff with
yeah, I think I saw that mentioned. Yeah, I think I saw that mentioned the other day by someone, and I'm now gonna have. Now I've heard someone recommend it personally to me. I'm now gonna have to go and check it.
Let's check it out. Yeah. I mean, if you like Italo disco or any sort of like synth poppy stuff, you'll probably potentially be into it.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, yeah, and I don't know. My tastes are pretty eclectic these days. The band that I probably obsessed about the most over the last few years was the Cleaners from Venus. But I mean, it's not a new band. But there's lots of great music that's being made out there. There's a band I was really enjoying called the Guests for a while there. I think they're pretty much done at this point. But they were a really cool band. There's so much. I don't know. I mean, there's just so much interesting stuff. And I myself, like, maybe it's because I always think of it as, I've gotten older, so I'm listening to, such a wide variety of stuff. But I think probably it's just that I'm doing the same thing all the kids are doing, which is listening to everything because you can access it so easily. And you learn that, wow, there's great music, all over the place. Like, again, like my sort of recent obsessions have probably are not really relevant to post-punk or death rock or anything like that. Like listening to a lot of Ted Hawkins, which is an old kind of I don't even know, soul kind of folk act from California, and Charlie Crockett, which is contemporary sort of country from Texas. And I don't know, every day is something different, and there's just the ability to access so much new music all the time.
I think it's slightly terrifying now that we use Spotify and we use other elements like that. They're recommendation engines. Now I've got a few years history in Spotify. Is terrifying because it will, I'll now listen to the Discover Weekly thing I get on the Monday, and I'll listen to my release radar on Friday, and suddenly I'm like, oh, that's what that band sounds like, and I quite like them. Maybe Spotify got that one right after all. But I don't want it to go entirely to algorithm-based recommendations, because for me it's always been the buzz of, you shoot the shit with your friends about music. You might mention on social media that, guys, this album is amazing, and someone else might reciprocate and go, actually, you might want to try this too. And that's been kind of almost the thing for 30 years. My stepbrothers and I, when we were teenagers, were trading music with our friends, because that was how we discovered new stuff. A new tape would come our way with something really random and something completely inappropriate on the other side that wouldn't be anything like the first one, but hey, we like them both. And now it's no longer tapes, but thankfully, but now it might be, we might spend outrageous amounts of money on vinyl or on CDs or even just downloads. But it's, there is that kind of thing of expand your mind. There's always music out there in the world. There is going to be something interesting there somewhere. But sometimes it's a little overwhelming. In terms of your music and how you compose, what's the way this is? It kind of very much a group thing, or do you individually bring ideas to the table and then see how things develop?
It's gone through different periods in the past. Like sometimes people will bring a riff and we'll all work around it. Sometimes people will bring like a fully formed song. Like Zach was saying earlier, I've been working on a lot of demos where I'll like kind of play everything myself right now, but Zach also will bring like riffs and we'll kind of work off that, and it all kind of just depends on the process. It all depends on who writes and what happens.
But yeah, both things totally. Yeah, they happen simultaneously, and it's just kind of there's no sort of one way to do it from our, historically for us anyway. And
over in Vancouver at the moment, they're obviously my contemporaries who write, Alex and Bruce at I Die You Die, have been writing about Vancouver and much more for many, many years as well now. But there seems to be a feeling that the Vancouver scene has got such a kind of a wide diversity to it in terms of not only the styles, but the people making the music and the kind of the attitude. Do you think is that down to the way that the city kind of is perceived, or do you think there's something a little more to it than that? In terms of like how
kind of the scene, I don't know. I don't even really know how to answer that. It's because it almost feels like, even though like maybe like a band like Actors and us, like for example, we've come at it from such different kind of backgrounds and different places, but we kind of are like somewhat contemporary genre-wise and scene-wise, but kind of feels like we like completely run in different circles. Aside from like, I record a lot with the people from Actors and have interactions with them, but like it's weird how that happens, because I think it kind of, unfortunately, a little bit goes back to those old like subcultural scene divisions. And like, I always feel like this weird kinship to like punk stuff, and I always am involved with that scene. And even though that's not the music I really make, like I find myself at a lot of those shows and like pretty involved with that scene on like a personal level in a strange way. And I think it's that kind of is Vancouver. There's different people that come at like a similar type of music, but from completely different kind of reference points, and that kind of feels like what makes the diversity in that scene here.
And I think,
that's kind of a strange answer, but
yeah, like over the years, we've sort of talked to people about that. Like, what is it about Vancouver or the Pacific Northwest or something that lends to a certain sound or whatever? And I think people, the very sort of low hanging fruit is people say, oh, it's gloomy. The weather is like, pretty gray and rainy most of the year. And that's ingrained, but I don't really think that that's necessarily true. And I don't know, I don't know where it comes from, but I do think that part of the deal is, I mean, Vancouver is really not very hospitable to people playing music. I mean, it's a very difficult thing to do here. It's an extremely expensive city to live in. Even finding space to rehearse in can be difficult. Venues, historically, it's a bit better these days, but historically venues would last for anywhere from 1 to 6 months or something, and then get shut down. And so it was always this scramble. And I think if anything, it's people's dedication to sort of like, despite the adversity that the city throws at you, we're just going to keep doing this thing. We're going to keep making music. We're going to keep starting new venues. We're going to keep finding a place to play and saving our money to buy equipment we can't afford and paying for recording sessions we don't have the cash for. And I think maybe that's what it is. I don't really know. I mean, Vancouver is a strange city in a lot of ways. It's become much more sort of international and cosmopolitan over the last 20 years than it historically ever was. It used to be much, very working class kind of resource town, and things have really changed. So I'm not sure what the sort of special sauce is here, but it is kind of interesting. And I think it's also Canada in general is a big city with very few, or a big country with very few cities. And if you are a sort of, alternative type person from Western Canada, oftentimes you're going to gravitate towards Vancouver because it is kind of the only really big city, certainly the only big like international city in the West. And so there's always kind of this new crop of people arriving that are coming from, some small place and bringing their interests and their ideas and usually a group of friends with them. And so I think I'm sure that's a factor as well.
I think there's probably a thing to be said that there's a number of those things kind of probably tick similar boxes in London, although not London's distance from anywhere, because, our distances here are rather different to yours. But I think, the kind of the trials around finding rehearsal space, the trials around finding venues, the trials around kind of the cost of living here. I now live outside of London because we've moved out because we decided we wanted a quieter life during lockdown, and it was also a lot cheaper to do. But there is those kind of issues are something that are hit here as well, and it's a massively creative city, or at least sometimes it is. And I think I think that kind of adversity, I think that's something that's really important in that the alternative scene as a wider thing is always an idea of people fighting back against a system that maybe doesn't really want them. and they go off and find their own way to do things. And it means that they're kind of maybe that little bit more determined to do it. And I kind of, we're a small fish in a very large pond. But sometimes our scene breaks through and makes some surprising, surprising successes. I mean, on the face of it, if you want to go back to Joy Division, I mean, really, a band as relentlessly gloomy as that, we're not in a good space. Their lead singer killed himself, and still they're kind of the touch point for this entire thing. If you think of post-punk, if you kind of talk to the person on the street and mention the word post-punk or, gloomy rock, probably Joy Division will come up first. And it's kind of amazing to think that they weren't very big in their time, but they now have this towering shadow that they kind of cast over everyone, whether we like it or not. But I think there is so much more to what you guys do, what other bands do in this scene, than just trying to name it as one band. Because as you pointed out tonight, there are so many other ways that you can look at this, and there are other ways that other people are looking at this. And I think that's what makes for a fascinating scene, is that it isn't just one sound. Some people might try and say it is, but I don't think it is. But you sometimes have to look fairly carefully to find the right bands that sound something different,
Yeah, for sure. It's hard to sort of know like what draws people to the scene and keeps them coming and keeps them making music. And especially, I mean, there's no, it's not, this is in the 70s, nobody's making money doing this. And there's no, we have been very fortunate to have the support of a label like Artifact, which has really been able to put resources behind us and do things that we've always had to struggle for in the past. So we're very sort of thankful to have that now, but it was a long road to get there. And for most people, it's just, it's a labor of love that you just come back for and you keep doing. Just, maybe it's masochism or something. I don't know.
Well, I think that's a good place to end this on, a bit of positivity, and that, think we will move on from all of this. You guys will start playing shows shortly. So where is your first show? Is it in Vancouver you're doing the first show?
It is, yeah, on the 18th at a place called the Bullet Farm. It's like a punk venue.
The Bullet Farm. Wow,
Farm.
What a name.
Yeah, I think I believe it's a Road Warrior reference. It's a small sort of DIY venue that actually opened up during COVID. I don't know how a venue sort of who got it in their head to open a venue during COVID. Well, I know who did it. But that it's a new addition to town, so we're excited to play there. We just filmed a music video there. A lot of people are filming music videos these days there. So yeah, we're looking forward to that.
And you've got Nostalgia was out last year on Artifact, and you've got your new album sometime in 2022, presumably then.
Hopefully. We've also got a singles collection with 2 new songs that haven't been released yet, coming out relatively soon, I believe.
Yeah, there's 2 brand new songs on there, and then 3 sort of never before released versions of older songs, and then all the singles that have been out of print forever. So that is slated to be released in November, and the new singles will be out in September and October. So we're excited about that. And yeah, we're going to be back in the studio in February, providing that no lockdowns or any curveballs come our way that keep us out of there, to record a new LP, and hopefully 2022 brings in a return to touring and live gigs, at least outside of town.
And for the benefit of the people watching this, tell me your social media handles so that we can direct people there.
Yeah, our Instagram page is Spectres Vancouver. There's a UK based Spectres as well. Also, but yeah, we make it easy for people. We're Spectres Vancouver, and then we're just Spectres, all capitals, on Facebook. And those are 2 very easy ways to get in touch with us. And otherwise, you can email us at spectresvancouver@gmail.com.
Marvelous. All right. Well, thank you very much, guys. It's been, I know it's still relatively in the morning, I think, Vancouver. Morning, afternoon, Vancouver time-ish?
Afternoon, yeah.
Yeah, afternoon. Yeah. It's a bit later here this evening. But thank you very much for joining us at Stay Fest. And we will hopefully, obviously travel allowing, we'll hopefully see you in the UK at some point when you come through here touring.
We'd love to.
All right.
Thanks, Adam.
Thanks, guys. Thanks very much.
Cheers.